Hey my lovelies, happy Friday and welcome back to the Love Notions channel. I'm your girl Kris, also known as Unsocial, right here on YouTube, as well as over on TikTok, Instagram and Facebook, and you can find me on my very own blog, www.unsocial.com. Now I'm super excited to be back here for another Feature Friday video, this time showcasing the Harmony top. Now the Harmony comes in the Love Notions standard sizing, which is extra small all the way up to a 5XL, and it has two cup options, one for the standard bust and the other for a full bust for those of you who have a bigger than 4-inch difference between your high bust and your full bust. Now, in my opinion, the Harmony top is a staple in anybody's wardrobe, and it does come with 4 different sleeve options, ranging from a sleeveless option to this short sleeved option with a flutter sleeve and a cap sleeve in between. Perfect for those of you heading into fall. I think this will make for a great layering piece, and also for those of you who are headed into spring. Now, for those of us who just have hot weather all year round, then Harmony is a definite choice for me in my wardrobe. Now for today's Feature Friday, I am going to be sharing with you guys 5 tips for applying bias binding. Now the Harmony top does finish off the neckline, and for the sleeveless option, the arm side, using bias binding. So if you're interested to hear my 5 top tips when working with bias binding, then keep watching this video. Tip number 1. Where possible, choose bias binding in the same weight as your main fabric. Now there is store-bought bias binding available, and Wright's is a very popular brand. But I find that this bias binding is a little bit stiff, especially when applying to drape your fabrics. You might be able to find online haberdasheries that provide custom-made bias binding, like does Laura of the Specky Seamstress, but if that is not an option for you, then you might want to consider making your own. Now, when you're going through the Harmony instructions from Love Notions, there is a hyperlink that directs you to an online blog showing you how to make your own bias binding. Now, I have used this very same blog tutorial when I have made my own bias binding, and can I say I enjoy the process? Not as much as I enjoy sewing generally. I don't think bias binding is necessarily my forte, but I do think it gives a nicer and much more professional finish, and sometimes I just have to bite the bullet and get on with it. Plus, when you make your own bias binding, it means that you can use up your scrap fabrics and create some fun bias for your projects, thereby giving them some more personal touches. In my case, I decided to use some viscose I had left over from a different project to make my pink and white sort of zebra striped bias binding, which I thought was just a fun addition to my Harmony blouse. Tip number 2. If you can, where possible, attach your bias binding with your main pieces flat. For example, the instructions for the Love Notions Harmony has you finish off your shoulder and side seams, insert your sleeve, and then go back and bias finish the neckline. I personally have found it so much easier to finish the neckline even before sewing my side seams together. This means that my bodice is still flat, and it allows me to maneuver it a little bit more easily around my machine, and I think it helps me to maintain just a little bit more control over the installation of my bias binding. Mark you, it is not always possible to do it this way, but where it is, I always choose to install my bias binding before finishing the rest of my garment. Tip number 3. When you have attached your bias binding right side to fabric, make sure to trim your seam allowances to reduce the bulk in the bias finish. Now, when I'm trimming my seam allowances, I like to use my pinking shears just so that it can help control fraying. And it also has the additional benefit of clipping sort of triangular notches into your fabric, which helps to relax your seams, particularly since bias bindings are applied to curved areas like your neckline and your arm side. If you don't own pinking shears, it's fine to use a duckbill pair of scissors or your regular scissors, but just go slowly and be careful not to clip into your main fabric pieces. Ask me how I know. Jeez. Tip number 4. Your edge stitch foot should become your best friend whenever you are applying bias binding, because it helps you when understitching. What am I talking about? Try understitching your seam allowances to your bias binding and you'll see for yourself how much easier it will be to turn your bias binding to the inside or the outside as the case may be. When understitching, you want to first press your seam allowances towards your bias binding. Then you want to run on over to your machine and sew the seam allowance to your bias binding about 1/8 of an inch away from your seam. When I'm understitching, I like to increase my stitch length to a 3.0, that is just a little bit longer than my typical stitch length of 2.5 millimeters. And then I depend on my edge stitch foot for an even application of stitches around my bias binding. Can you understitch without an edge stitch foot? Absolutely, but it will require a little bit more skill, a little bit more patience, and a little bit more time in order to get it neatly done. Once your edge stitching has been done, you want to head on over to your iron, press your bias binding to the inside, pin it into place, and then get ready for tip number 5. Tip number 5, if you are a more confident sewist, then you might want to try attaching your bias binding by top stitching. Yes, you heard me correctly, top stitching. This means that the right side or main side of your stitching will be even in the off chance that your bias binding is not. You'll want to make sure that your thread matches perfectly to your project in instances such as this, so just in case your stitches don't turn out to be as evenly from your top side, it won't be that noticeable. Whatever your skill level, take your time, go slowly, and enjoy the process. It's only fabric and thread. If you make a mistake, you can grab your unpicker, or you can just choose to ignore that mistake and keep on moving. At the end of the day, sewing should be fun, and perfection is kinda overrated, at least in my opinion. Once your bias binding has been stitched into place, hit it with a little extra steam just to set your stitches, and then finish off your Harmony blouse and get ready to eat up all of those compliments about how amazing your Harmony blouse looks.
Alright folks, those were my 5 top tips when working with bias binding. Now before I leave, I'm going to share with you just a few more thoughts on the Love Notions Harmony. Now the Harmony is meant for woven fabrics, and I opted to make the size 12 in the standard bust option with the short sleeves. I used some leftover viscose fabric that I had in my stash, and I'm really pleased with how it turned out. I'm just gonna pop a twirl in right here so that you can get a better appreciation for how beautiful this top drapes on my body. Now I did have to do a couple of adjustments to this pattern, including a 1/2 inch sloping shoulder adjustment. I had to lower the bust dart by 1/2 inch, and I also removed a 1/4 inch in length between my shoulder and my bust point on my front bodice piece only. This helps with my forward rotated shoulders, and it just prevents my neckline from sort of slipping towards the back and giving me that uncomfortable choking feeling. Now this pattern is a beginner friendly pattern, so if you are new to sewing, I would 10/10 recommend grabbing this pattern and giving this one a try. Now if you happen to be a more advanced sewist, then I still think that this is a great pattern to have in your stash, just because in my opinion it's super versatile. Now if I were to rank my sew out of a 10, I would give my top perhaps an 8 or a 9 out of 10. I really like the fabric choice, it drapes nicely over my body, but it was a little bit more difficult to work with just because viscoses tend to be a little bit slippery, and therefore the cutting and sewing process can be a little bit more challenging. I think in hindsight I probably should have used a bias tape that more closely matched my fabric. Now while I like the pop of uniqueness that it gives to my blouse, I kind of think you can see the imprint of the bias binding in my main fabric if you look at it a little bit too closely. I think maybe I might be nitpicking, but for those reasons I would give my blouse an 8 or 9 out of 10.
Now that is all I wanted to share with you guys today about the Love Notions Harmony. I'm hoping that you found my bias binding tips helpful. If you did, go ahead and give this video a thumbs up and drop me some comments down below letting me know if you found my tips helpful and whether you utilize any additional tips that I did not share when you are working with bias binding. I'm pretty sure that I will find them helpful, and I'm sure that many others in the sewing community will find your input helpful as well. Now, if you enjoyed today's video and you would like to see more of me, then don't forget to run on over to my YouTube channel and over to my Instagram, where you can find me more regularly. If not, then I'll see you back right here on the Love Notions channel at a different time. Now, until then, stay calm, stay cool, stay safe, and go get yourself the Harmony Blouse pattern. Peace.